On Friday, I put out a video which was a part 1 of the process of making a mask from plaster. It's been more of a learning process for me than an actual tutorial because I haven't touched plaster since 9 months ago or so. So this is me just relearning and also noticing a lot of attributes of plaster that I hadn't noticed in the past. One thing that I wanted to mention was that it seems really obvious. I don't know why this had never crossed my mind, but that's that whatever you're making, the weight of it is going to significantly decrease as the plaster is setting, and that's obviously because the water is evaporating. As I mentioned in the end of my last video, this video is going to be all about the decoration process. So I went ahead last night and I started plastering the mouth because I wanted to have it set a little bit overnight. I thought that it would be pretty set by now, but it's still it's not completely set, it's not a putty anymore, but it's still not chalky. But that's okay because that means that I can still go in. I have these 2 tools, they're just made for working with plasticine or clay or whatever. You can get them for like $1, or you can use just like a butter knife or something, but I'm gonna use it to carve away at the teeth a little bit as it's still workable. And then I can't decide whether it would be worth doing a coat of polyurethane before I put the acrylic paint layer on it. I know before I put on the pigmented paint, I'm gonna put on just like a layer of gesso. Gesso is a preliminary layer before you start putting on your pigments. And in this case, because I'm using acrylic, I'm gonna use an acrylic-based gesso. Because when you paint directly on plaster with acrylic, all the water from it will just seep directly into the plaster because plaster is an extremely absorbent surface. So you want to gesso it just so that the paint is still workable and you can spread it out instead of it all just seeping into the surface. So I think I'm just going to show you how I'm carving the teeth, and then I'm going to do the gesso, and then I'm going to paint it, and then I'll be done. Okay, so I didn't do a voiceover for this part while I was filming it, but basically I'm mixing up a little bit of plaster and I'm going to be patching up areas around the face that are cracking a little bit too much, because the best glue for plaster is actually just plaster. So make sure when you're patching up any cracks that you want to get it inside the crack. You don't want to just smear it on top, because if you just smear it on top, it's not really going to glue anything together. You want to really make sure it gets underneath the crack. And then I'm going to start building up the mounds for where the teeth are, and then I'm going to shape it as well as I can and let it set, and then I'm gonna carve it. So that's basically it, and I'm gonna let it just play. So at this point, the plaster's already started to set a little bit so that it's like a malleable putty texture, and I don't have to be as gentle as I had to be before. The stage that it's in right now, it is very close to being too set to work with, so you have to go really quickly. At this stage, I like to use my fingers because it's going to be more pressure than a brush. And it also allows me to really smooth out each of these areas, you know, under the eyes and around the teeth. I can get really specific about the texture on it. It doesn't have to be perfect because I'm still going to go in with that wooden tool later and scrape away, because the mounds are like where the teeth are a little bit too voluminous, and I wanted to make them a little bit flatter in the final version. But that's okay. It's better to have more plaster on it than not enough, because you can always sand it or scrape it away later. And that's what I ended up doing. So at this point I mixed a little bit more plaster because the little bit that I had mixed before already set, and I'm just doing like a really thin coat of a really liquidy plaster just to do a smoother finish on what I've built up so far. And as it's starting to set a little bit more, I'm going to build up more and keep going back and forth just to get the shape that I want. These are the tools that I was talking about earlier. And I'm really just gonna, because the plaster isn't set completely and it still has a pretty wet texture, I'm just gonna carve away at the surface, shape out the teeth the way that I want, shape out the mouth, and go back in with a little bit more sanding probably. And I'm using these pads that you put on the surface of a palm sander because they work just as well. I'm just gonna go in and carve away. Most of the shaping that I did with the teeth already was while the plaster was still wet. I'm just going in and defining a little bit more. So to brush away any excess powder, I just have this isn't the best brush for this. It should be less dense, but this is just a wall painting brush. And I'm just gonna use it to brush away any of the powder. So another thing that I learned in the process of doing this was that I really should have kept the surface of the plaster on top of the bandages when I was spreading. Like in the first video, I show how I do a coating of liquid plaster on top of the plaster bandages to try to get a smoother surface. And I worked with the plaster while it already started to congeal a little bit because I was explaining something and I waited too long, and that was a huge mistake because that's what led it to crack so much. I just had a couple millimeters of plaster and I thought that was still thin enough where it wouldn't crack. But last night when I was sanding, I put a little bit of plaster bandage just around where the horn meets the face, just for a little bit of reinforcement, because it kept cracking specifically in this area because the horns, they're not heavy, but it was just a little bit heavier than the face considering these are more dense. So I did that, and when I just put because there's already plaster in the bandages, of course, I just rubbed it to the surface, just in the same way that you would like do circular motions with your foundation to fill in your pores. I had like just approached it the same way to fill in the little gaps in the bandages just to have a smooth surface. And this surface right here is so sturdy, and the layer of plaster is incredibly thin, like not even a millimeter. And I'm kind of punching myself over the fact that I hadn't thought to do that earlier. I don't know why I thought that I wouldn't be able to get that surface that I wanted, but I highly recommend following that instead of what I showed in the last video. I mean, I'm pretty happy with how the mouth came out. It's like, of course I can go in and I can try to make everything as smooth as possible, but when you're working with something at this scale, it's, unless you're gonna put all your time into it for a while, it's just not gonna be perfect. And I have a couple more masks to do, so of course you can go in and sand it until it's completely smooth, and you can carve everything so it's symmetrical just in the film. This is how it is in the film, and you can go in and fill in every single crack. I'm pretty content with how this looks for now, so I think I'm gonna keep it like this. And honestly, like as I talked about in my, I think 2 videos ago, my first video, I did a video talking about interpreting a character rather than making a very literal recreation of it. And I think for this, I'm just going to allow myself to approach it in the same way and kind of embrace the cracks just because of the material that it is. You can't force a material to be something else. That's something that I learned at art school, where you just, if what medium you have available is what you have to just make do with how it wants to react to the way that you're using it. I'm sorry that there's a dog barking. The garage is open. I'm not sure how they made those masks in the original film. I'm sure that they was like, oh, they had a mold and they were pouring them with something a lot more durable, but this is what I'm doing, and I honestly think that the little cracks in it, maybe I can add a little bit of shading to them and make it like really a part of the character, because I feel like if I embrace it, it could really elevate the Halloween-y aspect. I don't know, it kind of makes it more creepy. So I'll see what I do in a little bit, and I'll catch you then. Okay, so I just came back from skating with Matthew. He's doing his homework in the corner, and I flipped the camera because light's coming from over there. I might do a couple layers of gesso on the mask, and I'm going to come back to this tomorrow because I feel kind of lazy today. I know I thought that I would upload this on Monday, but I have 15 subscribers, so I don't think it matters that much. The paint that I'm using to do the gesso layer is just this huge jar of white acrylic. This is just a titanium white. I'm also hoping, because this paint is really thick, it'll fill in the smaller gaps in the plaster. And because I'm gonna let it dry overnight, I can be pretty generous with the layer that I'm putting on, because it's not like I have to get back to it today. Already I can tell that, oh, you can't really tell this is like overexposed. But already I can tell that it's a much smoother finish than just what the plaster gave. And also because acrylic paint the base is acrylic, which is plastic. If you do a pretty thick layer, it's gonna work a little bit like some kind of enamel, or in a similar way that the polyurethane might act. Definitely not as strong because it's not made for that, of course. If you build up the layer thick enough, it will be kind of like an exoskeleton of sorts. So that's what I'm gonna try to do. Again, I'm like trying to just embrace the texture of this, because I was kind of for a couple of days frustrated that the plaster wasn't working in exactly the way that I wanted or that I intended. But again, you have to just let the material do what it does. You have to just embrace what the medium is telling you. Use its qualities to your advantage rather than force it to have qualities that it wouldn't naturally have just for the sake of your project. If you want it to have a quality that it just doesn't naturally have, you might as well just use a different medium. Last night I finished just cleaning up the teeth a little bit, filling in any of the cracks that I could manage. I mean, it's still cracking. I'm gonna just try to mix it in with the design of the mask and make it an element. Even though it's not in the character, I'm going to just work with medium and do what it allows me to do. I gessoed it, so I have a primed surface to paint on, and I'm gonna be using acrylic paint, and I'm gonna just use the primary colors, because one of the best things that you can do when you're painting is just understand how to mix every color that you need just based off of the primaries, because then it saves you a lot of money because you don't have to buy that many paints. And then also because you have a similar base for all your colors, all the colors are going to look good together because they're going to be in the same tonal range, and all of the undertones of each color is going to be the same. So I'm going to be using about a couple of years ago, I got myself as a gift for the beginning of the school year these 2 tubs of paint from Blick. I think they're $17 each, but they've lasted me forever, and these are 2 of my favorite colors. This one is just ultramarine, and this one is cadmium red light. They look amazing together. They mix like a really beautiful purple, like a cool purple tone that works really well in shadows. The yellow that I'm going to be using, because I don't have a yellow that I've chosen to go with these colors, I have a couple options, and I don't know what's going to look the best. These are just ones that I found in my paint stash. This one is Indian yellow. This one has a yellow deep. What? And then this one is just primary yellow. I don't know how these are going to react with the other colors that I have, but I'm just going to try them out and see what happens. And then some useful things to have for paint application. I just brought like a larger brush and then a smaller brush for painting smaller areas. And then I also have these little little sponges. I'll probably be using these to do a light shading in the cracks so it looks more intentional. I recommend having a surface to put your paints on. I'm just using a white plate, but any non-porous surface will do. You should probably use like a palette, but I don't have one on hand, so that's what I'm going to be using. A palette knife would be probably the best option. I don't have one of those on me right now, but if you're working with a tub, just so you don't mix any colors into it, I would recommend spooning out a little bit and putting it on your plate so that you can work with it on a different surface. I'm going to use the white that I used as my gesso, and I'm not using black. Having just a straight black paint, it's helpful, it quickens up the process, but it lacks a lot of dimension when you're putting it against other tones from the same family. So I'm going to be mixing my own darker tones. You're never going to get it to a perfect black. Will be a much more convincing shadow tone. Alright, so now I'm going to just be spooning out a little bit of each of my paints, and I'm going to give them their own space on the palette. My paints are a little bit contaminated already because I used to not do this, even though I should have, because I did not take as good care of my tools as I should have, which is something that my parents always told me was one of the most important things about being an artist, is to respect your workspace and respect your tools. Keep everything really clean, which I never really took seriously, but now, as I'm getting older, I really understand the gravity of what that means, which is also why I cleaned up I swept the floor and I put away the tarp and everything before working on this. You know, when you have a clean base and a clean surface to work on, you feel a lot more organized in your mind. You feel less distracted by the mess around you. And a lot of people think, well, I'll just clean up at the end. It's not a big deal. But I highly recommend cleaning up as you go. So the surface of this mask seems to be kind of a salmon-y color. Thankfully, it's more on the orange side, which is going to work really well with this cadmium. It's a little bit muted, so to mute it a little bit, I'm probably going to add a little bit of yellow and blue just to pull it more towards gray. The next thing I'm going to talk about is creating your highlights and shadows. So you always want your shadows to be cool toned, which was a mistake that I used to make in high school all the time. I used to mix my shadows using like a burnt sienna, and unless you're adding like a lot of blue to that to really neutralize that tone, it's going to come across really warm and it's not going to make sense visually. It's just your brain isn't really going to comprehend it because it's like really unnatural and doesn't look good. I'm going to take the pink that I just made and I'm going to make one side brighter and I'm going to make it warmer for the highlights, and then for the shadows I'm going to add more blue. I'm still going to keep it neutral, but I'm going to make it more cool toned. I don't want it to be purple, I want it to be gray. Back to the drawing board for this one. I'm going to take this flat angled brush and a little bit of water. I'm going to take a little bit of blue. There's already a lot of natural shadows that are being cast just because of the three-dimensionality of this piece. A little bit around the mouth because I want there to be an illusion of more of a lip. So after I have that preliminary shadow on, I'm actually going to go back to my plate and I'm going to darken up this color, adding more blue, more yellow, more red until we get something that's more neutral. You want to add this darker tone very lightly, just around where you want to emphasize the greatest shadowy areas of the face. So very deliberately. You can even use your finger, you can use a sponge to blend it out. Maybe I'll take the sponge with a little bit of this pink on it. So now that I've applied a little bit of shadow, I'm going to go in and I'm going to talk about highlights to really raise the dimension of the face. The shadows are doing some of it, but what's really going to make it pop is the highlight. And you want to be very, very light with where you add the highlights on the face because you want it not to be the focal point. You just want it to enhance the shadows. I'm going to go back to my little plate palette, flat angled brush, and I'm going to work on this side because here I have my shadow. I'm going to take a little bit of white and just add it into here. And I want it to have a bounciness, a vibrancy, but I still want it to be subtle. So now that I have this like paler pink over here, just to really emphasize the higher points of the face, a lot of this is like contouring. Back to the makeup references. I'm really just applying this in the same places that you would apply your contour and highlight. Also, never underestimate your intuitive reaction when you're painting. Sometimes you kind of just have to follow what your body is telling you to do before your brain even decides whether it's logical or not, because a lot of art is kind of just trusting your gut and not overthinking these decisions. It's going to make your piece look a lot less forced and overthought. And being really natural and trusting of yourself really comes out in an artwork. Your audience, never underestimate what kind of feeling is being radiated through your piece. Your audience, no matter who they are, whether they be like high-end art critics or just the average person, they will always feel the energy that you put into it. So if you're feeling really confident and relaxed and kind of trusting of yourself and you're working on something, that feeling will really project when it's being viewed. It's just a little bit of human spirit right there. You know, even if you have no background in art, everyone feels something when they look at work, and it will most likely be whatever you put into the piece. One of my least favorite parts about art school was during critique, they would always ask us to over-explain the work instead of allowing the audience to just gather what they wanted from it. Because even if it wasn't exactly what you were trying to get across, they were still feeling something, and that's the most important part. You know, once a piece is over-explained, or even the artist themselves makes a statement about it, it really takes away a lot from the experience. Now I'm just kind of trusting myself to make these formal decisions about the surface of this mask. I'm going in just kind of some areas and making it a little bit more red, some areas making it more peachy. It's really about the feeling, and also the surface, if anything, is really, it's not one color. I'm gonna add a little bit of variation in some areas to that original coral that we put down. That variation is gonna give it a lot of dimension as well. For now, this is what I'm gonna think. For now, I'm gonna leave it like that. Looking at the mouth, it looks kind of black on the inside. And even looking at this, I'm realizing that the teeth are pretty jagged, which is nice because in some areas, you know, the teeth got kind of messed up. Let's mix a really, really dark tone. Let's try to mix the darkest tone that we can. So I'm gonna take this red, I'm gonna mix it over here. Take this red, and take a lot of blue, because blue is the darkest color that we have on our palette right now. And it's okay if our dark tone is a little bit purple on the purple side, because at least it's gonna be cool tone and it's gonna read better for the shadow anyway. So already, if you look over here, I have something that's really dark. Because this cadmium is not a true red, it's on the more orange side, there's already a little bit of yellow in it, and it's gonna kind of neutralize that tone anyway. It's gonna make not a true purple, but a muted purple. And honestly, I'm pretty okay with this color already. I don't know if I'm gonna add any yellow because I don't want to accidentally brighten it up, but I'm gonna see what it looks like once I apply it to the surface of the plaster and see if I need to add any yellow to really mute this color further. Alright, so as I'm applying this, I'm starting to notice that this is very purple. So I'm gonna take a little bit of that darkest yellow so I don't accidentally add any more brightness than I need. But just I'm gonna add that a little bit to neutralize this color a little bit more. I'm gonna add more blue so it's the coolest shade of purple that we can get. It's okay if you have to do several layers of the paint. You don't want it to come out really thick because then it's going to be harder to get that crisp edge. So I might go in and do a second layer after it dries anyway. It might be also easier to do this portion of the face in like a Sharpie or a paint marker just because it's so intricate. I'm also going to clean up the shape of the teeth because some of these are a bit wonky. I'm going to do a final pass over the exterior of the mouth with pink anyway to clean up any of the lines that I might have gotten a bit messy, so I'm not too pressed about that. Alright, now that I'm pretty happy with the way that the dark of the mouth looks, I'm gonna go in and fix up the teeth. I'm just gonna do another coat of white on it to get rid of any of the other colors that I might have accidentally tinted it with. The teeth in The reference photo that I'm using, they're a little bit gray, so I'm gonna add a little bit of shadow around the teeth to add a bit more dimension. Now that I'm satisfied with how the mouth looks, I'm going to try to do something with most obvious cracks. This is where we get into the realm of interpretation rather than making a direct copy of the mask in the film. So for instance, I have this really obvious crack right here, and to fill it in, I'm going to take the smallest brush that I have. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take on this brush the darkest color that we mixed, just on the very tip of the brush, and I'm going to emphasize my crack and just run the brush very gently along the inside of the crack. You see what I mean? It's not really on the actual surface, but in the actual crack, it's showing the inside of the face rather than just the plaster. And then whatever is left over on the surface, I'm just gonna wet my finger a little bit and just rub it. And maybe I'll even shade in around the eye sockets a little bit because in the film, it's really dark in the eyes. And then I'm just gonna continue to fill in the cracks. Here's another one that I see is pretty deep and has like nice placement. Now, I want these cracks to be pretty subtle. I don't want them to be taking up too much attention on the face. So I'm gonna be really, really specific about how much I'm gonna let the definition around the crack bleed out. So I'm finally down to the last step to complete this mask, and that is the polyurethane. So this one happens to be matte. Are you filming? Are you filming?
I think you just got my pupils.
No. Ah!
Yeah, let's go to the kitchen because it's better lighting. Okay.